Okay. There were a few people who could not be with us today who really wanted the opportunity to hear this case. So I am now recording recording our time. So who has a story that they would like to share? Remember that you're on mute, so you have to take yourself off mute in order to talk. Betty?
Hi, I will probably be much quieter than you're used to today because I have a very hard time moving the cursor when I'm using my laptop. But I wanted to say for sure that I'm so glad Emily is here. I never met any of John's children, and I'm so glad they're here. And also just wanted to say that John influenced my life more than anybody in my life except my husband and my parents. And I can't say more. I just think he's great.
All right, thank you, Betty, for that. We are now viewing Robert Jones' screen. So Robert, you need to stop screen sharing so that we can get back to seeing one another. Okay.
At least in theory, you can stop us from being allowed to share.
Okay.
You as the host can turn that off, at least in theory, under the settings.
Okay.
It's a good theory.
It is a good theory. I'm trying to figure out if I can make that happen. It's a lovely picture. All right, there we go. Thank you, Susie. I clearly needed technical support on this. Okay, so thank you, Betty, for your sharing. Who else has a story? Teresa?
Hi, everybody. I probably have a lot of stories and maybe not so many as a lot of you, but two come to mind. One of them is being in the Vermont House chamber, a packed chamber, and having John Nutting being one of the speakers who was testifying against the death penalty, and feeling really so proud of our church that we had this conference minister who was speaking so eloquently about this, and just so also amazed at how somebody can have the courage to and the faith to be there in front of all those people, you know, saying something that might be controversial. It was very inspiring. And the second story is that he came to Bethany Church, you know, as he did on occasion, and probably was in the pulpit or maybe was just a guest that day. And he talked about Central America Pilgrimage 2, which he was helping to organize. This was in 1990. The first pilgrimage was to Nicaragua in 1986. It was not a trip I was on. I hadn't been on any trips anywhere, and you know, had in my heart that I would like to do things like this, but never really spoke about it. And so John came and talked about Pilgrimage 2. It was going to be to El Salvador and Nicaragua. They were going to see what kind of progress was made since the Sandinistas took over and the war was over, and they were tacking El Salvador onto it. And when we got home that day, my husband said to me, "Oh, Teresa, I signed you up for the trip." And that was the beginning of a wonderful relationship that many of you know has been going on between Bethany Church and community in El Salvador for since 1991. And that was when I first got to meet Betty Edson and lots of other wonderful people. So John was responsible for all of that and much more in my life. Of course, you know, somebody surely will talk about Camp About Face and the Biliac, those kinds of things.
Okay. Thank you, Teresa. Someone else like to share? Kathy.
Caldwell.
Okay, Michael will be next. Kathy?
Bob and I came in the summer for summer ministry in 1974, and Hal Harrison was in charge of the youth workers, but we also had a lot of time with John Nutting. A wonderful introduction early on to ministry that is in action and social justice, as well as words. And Bob and I want to sing a song that John sang us back then.
You probably all know it, and some of you will know the verses.
We only know the chorus, but we still sing it.
We only know the chorus, and because we've got a son now who's the head of the fine arts program up at Johnson, we get a chance to be in Lamoille County quite a bit, and we just love the sentiment behind this, because it speaks of John was an old soul. Yeah. And he had a common touch, and this song really epitomizes that for me. Lay me down in Lamoille County, where the wind sashays through the pines. Lay me down in the shadow of Mount Mansfield, where the sun hardly ever shines. And he's there now.
Yeah.
We love you, John.
Thank you very much. Michael?
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, because that song is the one on his album that, you know, it relates to now. And, you know, I want to say also to Emily, I'm so glad you're here, because for the family to know, for you to interpret to the family how much John was loved and how influential he was with so many of us. I'm so glad you're here that you can, you know, convey that to everyone. I got John's tome off the shelf, his history of the conference, and, you know, there's so much to say, but one of the things that's in here that I thought would be a way to, you know, lift up one particular thing that John brought to all of us, is his relationship with the Native peoples. And right after his retirement from conference ministry in Hyde Park, which we hosted at that time in '96, John wrote this note in keeping in touch from June of '96, and he shared that one of the things that was the most important to him was the appreciation that the Abenaki had for him in Vermont, for, you know, helping them with their challenges and struggles, and persistence for recognition. And this is what he put in this note that the Lakes Band of the Abenaki people of the Northeast had written to him. To our brother John Nutting, we as members of the family of Indian people of Northwestern Vermont thank you for your dedication and commitment to the Abenakis of Vermont, and to our cousins the Cree and Innu of Great Whale. We thank you for your good thoughts, your humor, and your kind heart and spirit, which has spoken with us and on our behalf over the past few years. We are not the people who came into our homeland 10,000 years ago. We are not the people who met the priests, the fur traders, and the European settlers 200 years ago, but we still live here, and we go on living here. Through your help, our name, the people of the Dawnland, will be remembered. While we live and remember, you will be called honored among our respective elders, and we will teach our children about you. Thank you, the Lakes Band of the Abenaki people of the Northeast. So as they thank John, we all thank John, and we thank God for John. And, you know, it's just a new day, not only for the conference, but for Vermont and for so many of us that he touched for so many decades. So thanks for the chance to be together. It's great to see all of you.
Thank you, Michael. Let's see.
We can go next, unless there's someone else waiting.
That's great.
My name is Lisa White, and this is my dad, Donald Bailey. And we've known John since, John and Ramona since like 1956.
50.
Um,
I was working in Hyde Park, working in northern Vermont. We lived in Hyde Park. And this was in 1957. And our daughter was 2 years old then. And this was John's first church, of course. And we've known him ever since. Unfortunately, our stay in Vermont was very short. We moved to South America and was living in the mountains at the Andes for 5 years. But thanks to my wife, she kept in touch with John. Although we've known him for from 57 to 2020. We visited them several times at their home in Stowe, Eden, and they came to Maine to visit us several times during the summer. John would always bring his canoe, and he and I would paddle up and down the Kennebec River. John was a great guy for having coffee latte in the morning. If he didn't get that, I don't know what he would have done. But one time we had a trip when he was over to Maine. We went to Camden for a visit, and we were walking down the road to the wharf to look at the schooners. John was behind us, and we looked around, and he was gone. We couldn't figure out where he went, but then 15, 20 minutes later, he came walking in with a cafe latte in his hand. So he must have walked all over Camden looking for a place to buy one.
Thank you.
And I had the privilege of visiting him in Morrisville 3 or 4 times. And he agreed to do my wife's committal in New Hampshire.
3 years ago.
Yeah, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And our daughter was 2 years old then, and that's when she got to know John.
Right. And definitely maintained a friendship with him, you know. Years would go by without seeing them, but the one thing that I remember is, and it might have been Ramona who did this, but I got a birthday card every year up until, you know, a few years ago. But that was always just really nice to know that they still remembered me and took the time to send that card. So we'll miss him, both of them.
Thank you. Someone else want to share? Betty, you're.
This is Beverly.
Hi, Beverly.
Oh, okay. I'm on my phone. I lost internet, and so I'm kind of frazzled, but I'm glad I'm here. When they just mentioned the coffee latte or the cafe latte, it wasn't one of my quickest memories, but when I walked with John and Charles Chamberlain in a peace march in New York City many years ago, which first of all gave me some of John's art because he did some pencil sketches during that time, but he taught me to drink Bailey's Irish Cream in my coffee. That was the lesson I learned from John in New York that time. So he taught me a lot more valuable lessons than that, but that was one thing I think of. I have 2 things that I really remember John for. I think I had the opportunity to be an attendee at the first Peacemakers Breakfast that was held, and I'm not sure of the year, but I believe it was the first Peacemakers Breakfast at the Back Home Cafe upstairs on Center Street in Rutland, and it was the year that an annual meeting was held at Grace Church in Rutland. And we showed up with, I think it was Jones's Donuts, at 6 o'clock in the morning, and all of the people who spoke had been involved in foreign missions. So the one person I remember, I think, from that particular breakfast was Richard Huff Ross, speaking about his involvement with mission in Russia. And it was part of John's creativeness that put that program together, and so endears it to me, even though it's moved from breakfast to gathering. I still think it's such a valuable lesson for all of us. And the other memory, and perhaps more important to me, is that I attended John's retirement gathering at, I think it was the North Hyde Park Church, I'm not sure. I was an observer, and a local church minister whose name I can't recall told the story of making a call to John. She was having some kind of trouble with her congregation, and she probably gave details of that, but I don't remember those. I do remember John's advice to her, and he said, "You've just gotta love them." And she said it was the best advice she'd ever received, and it changed her ministry. And that advice has served me well for more than 20 years. When I served with as the mission associate for the Vermont Conference, "You just gotta love them" was very often the title of my sermon that I shared at the different churches that I was able to attend and spend time with. And it was the message and the advice that served me well as I pastored local churches in Vermont. And it still works in my life today. I remember regularly that the important message is you just gotta love them. So I thank John for that, and for so many other things, including Camp About Face in El Salvador and Mission Journal, which I missed for a long time. And I'm glad Emily is here. She was on the same trip to El Salvador that I was on with John. So it's nice to make that reconnection. Thanks.
Thank you, Beverly. Liz?
Good morning, everybody. I have memories of John that are, my memories are kind of all mixed up together. I spent years at Camp Weakoe, and of course John was there, and I just remember music, and the joy that John brought to everybody. When you speak of the peace breakfast, the first annual conference that I attended happened to be at Lake Moraine before we started going back. This was a long time back. And the first peace breakfast I attended, John was the leader of it. And I remember walking down those stairs into the dining room for breakfast, and just seeing that group of people, and it gets me every time when we sing "Let There Be Peace on Earth." I mean, I just, that does me in. The other memory I have is that John lived in Hyde Park, and by living in Hyde Park, he got to know my great-grandmother and my grandmother, who lived in Morrisville, and my mother. So many members of my family have been touched by John's life. And I was very sad to see that he had died. But I'm so grateful that I got to be part of his life in even a little bit of a way. So peace be with you, Emily. And to all of you.
Thank you, Liz. Barbara?
I think Betty had her hand up first.
Okay. Betty?
I'm sorry. I flirted it out before. Don Bailey, who was just speaking with his daughter, is now my next door neighbor at Morgan Orchards.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Barbara?
Lynn,
Yes?
this is Mary Lou.
Hi, Mary Lou.
May I speak now?
Sure.
A lot of you know that I worked in the conference office. So I worked with John for 16 years, and I have such fond memories of some personal stuff with John. I had actually met him before I ever came to Vermont at some national meeting. And one of the things that I loved about John was, for John, nothing was impossible. If somebody had something that they needed to work on, John had an idea for what could happen to resolve the situation. And he had a plan for my life at that point, even though I hardly knew him. And he said, Mary Lou, you should just borrow about $300 and do a survey of women in the UCC. And I don't know what he went on for that. And at that time, I was not involved at all beyond the local church and being a minister's wife. And so anyway, when I came to Vermont, thanks to Charles Chamberlain, before I ever started work in the conference office, I came to visit just to see what it was like and meet. I met Drusilla and I had dinner at her home. But John happened to be in the conference office when I was there. And I had checked out where I might live and found that rentals in Burlington, that was, the conference office was in Burlington then, were so expensive. And I was not getting paid a lot to be the administrative assistant. And so I thought I couldn't afford the job. And I was talking to John about it, and he right away says, oh, well, let's see, let's think about that. And he came up with a couple of suggestions. But one of them was, as a lot of you know, that at the time the conference office was in a home, a former home, and the conference office used the downstairs, and they rented out rooms upstairs. Incidentally, one of those rooms was rented by Bernie Sanders. I've always said that I slept in Bernie Sanders' office because what had been his office became my bedroom. But anyway, John said, well, maybe you could live upstairs. And maybe Charles would have the conference put in a bathroom and a kitchen up there for you. Well, I talked to Charles, and the conference had no money to do that kind of renovation. But he said, you certainly can live up there if you want to. So I did, but that was thanks to John. And there were other times that John and I went cross-country skiing early one morning at the Atkinson Retreat Center. It was 0 degrees. I remember saying to John, we are crazy. But I have so many fun memories of both work and play, John. But he certainly was my world. And I know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lou. I also, before I call on Barbara, who's next, I want to say that there is a chat function because we're using Zoom. So if you want to read some of the comments that are being made in the chat room, you can just click on chat and you can see those there. All right, Barbara.
Okay. Actually, Charlie and I will tag team. We were married 3 weeks when we moved into the parsonage in Jeffersonville in 1978. And John, bless his heart, took us under his wing. But I remember him first saying, huh, never thought I'd get a pair like you in here for years. And then he walked us through that. It was a challenging church in those days. And would keep good track of us. And then I remember many convocations, late nights sitting up talking with John and whoever liked to stay up that late at that point in time. And then when I returned to Jeffersonville in 2015, actually went to a breakfast at the Hyde Park Church where Charlie was pastor, and there were John and Ramona sitting in the dining room. And it felt like it came full circle. for me for all that coaching. And here I was still not only serving churches thanks to him, but I was back in Jeffersonville.
And I was the minister for him while I was the interim in Hyde Park for 3 years. And minister for both he and Ramona during her passing, and then his, as he was in the nursing home. And I'm just going to give you the last memory I have of him, which was my umpteenth visit to see him after all those years. And he, I did not have a chance to talk with him because he was in such a beautiful moment in the dining facility during the meal. And his table was not only filled with people, but it was surrounded by people. And he was telling stories. And that was more than I ever wanted to touch or even try to recreate. So that's the last one I'm giving to you.
I came across a paper going through files, and it was a paper we'd each filled one out, but Charlie filled it out probably in your late 30s, early 40s, about when I'm 50. And one of the things is, I would like to be most like, and he'd written down John Nutting and my father. And I think the last is just an interesting story, but Charlie, as you know, was a military chaplain for 30 years. So he and John had some interesting conversations about how God calls us into places we never thought we would be.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I thought I would. I was fortunate enough to receive a good portion of John's library at some point, probably 15 years ago or so. And one of the prized possessions is back in the mid to late 1950s, John was on the subscription service for Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. And so every time one was published, he would get it. And he read every one of them. It's a 12-volume set. And I think one or two of them are multi-volume. And I brought one in. I have it in the library out there. They're all this big. And they all have, I don't know if you can see that or not, but dozens or more of bookmarks in the volume. And then on every bookmark is a note. And I just turned to one, for example, to show you. I mean, we're talking really tiny text with lots of underlining and lots of notes. Anyway, on page 158 of volume 2, part 2, he has a note. It says, anti-nutting. John and I had arguments all the time about Karl Barth. He loved Karl Barth and referred to Karl Barth in conversations all the time and was obsessed with the problems that Karl Barth dealt with. And I can't stand Karl Barth. So he and I had this sort of constant battle. And I told him I would take your books as long as you would allow me to put the letters between Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth right next to it. And he said, well, it won't fit on the shelf, but you can put it below it if you want. So that's what I've done. John, aside from being a profound social activist and leader of the church, was a deep thinker about all sorts of things. And I had the good fortune of being in a book group with him where we read usually not theology, but science and sociology and American culture. Those were his particular interests. And one year he came home from Florida with a book in his hand that he had written, actually had transcribed from his notes about the many, 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 many books that he'd read over the years. And I don't know if anybody has a copy of that somewhere. Emily, do you know about this?
Emily, you're muted.
Yeah, no, I don't, but boy, I would sure love to get my hands on that.
Yeah,
I mean,
we're talking
a lot of books.
100 pages of notes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, just a wonderful thinker, and he always loved a good argument and a good sort of intellectual fight. So for as much as we did that, I remember him as a deeply kind soul and a man who loved not only people but also nature. My honor to know him.
Thank you, Peter. Judy?
Hi. I was on the Department of Mission with John, and we used to ride a lot to the meetings together. I was vice chair. And it just so shocked me when I saw Emily, because the last time I remember hearing about her, she was at Keene State. So I just had this picture of you in my mind, Emily, even though I never really met you. He was just a great guy. I also have somewhere in the debris of my house the songbook for saints and sinners that I think he put together for the camps that he used to have at Bethany Birches and everything. He's just an amazing person. You're lucky to have him as a dad.
Thank you.
Then my name's Roy Hill. Put me on the list to speak when it's appropriate.
All right, Roy, you're up.
Okay. Yeah, your response there reminds me of many reasons why in classes I wouldn't raise my hand, because when I raised my hand to make a point, then the teacher would call on me to make the point. Okay, Roy V. Hill here. My reflections on John Nutting. If I was a preacher, I'd probably title my reflections Experiencing John Nutting and Southern Hospitality. Let me put that in context of a sort, because that context might be helpful here. I should say I've been in Vermont over 30 years, coming from the beginning, which was on my grandfather's farm in segregated Tennessee. And I also come to Vermont, having served on the National Executive Council. I came, and I remember meeting John. Of course, at that time, I hadn't had the experience of New England's Frozen Chosen. I got a glimpse of that when I took a leave from Dartmouth to raise capital campaign monies for our 6 HBCUs, the 6 historically Black colleges and universities related to the United Church of Christ. I say I got an experience because Nat Guptill was the conference minister in one of the 2 states I had responsibilities for. And I remember making my first presentation to a gathering of clergy in Connecticut. And nobody said a word afterwards. And so that Monday morning, Nat Guptill says, "Roy, how did it go?" I said, "I bombed." Nobody reacted. I couldn't read the expressions, nothing. I bombed. He said, "Roy, you'd be happy to know they loved you. And not only did they love you, they voted to support the campaign." That was my exposure. Fast forward. So when I came to Burlington, my wife and I kept looking for a bit of that Southern hospitality, you might say. Being on a campus is totally different from being in a community. So that was a foreign exposure of sorts. But when I came to Vermont, and I remember the first meeting, and I don't recall anything except it was a UCC meeting. And this man walked in. The complexion of the room changed. No, you didn't go from black to white or white to black, but the complexion of the room changed. The air changed. The attitudes changed. The expressions on people's faces changed as I greeted him and as he spoke. And he and I obviously met there. And that meeting was like hospitality. That meeting was like speaking to someone whose mind of Christ was active. And he was sharing the energies and the skills that touched everybody in the room. And over the years, whenever he and I met and talked, it was like a continuation of that moment. He reached out with his words. He reached out with his nonverbals. He included you. You knew that you, or maybe I should say I knew, and I believe this is infectious, I knew that it was not tokenism. I knew if it was reception of some sort, he wouldn't be looking at the clock and saying, well, you know, it's over in 30 minutes and make certain you leave in 30 minutes. It was like, you are welcome. It was like a global understanding of the global family and being a member of that family. John had that capacity, that impact to say, we're members of God's family. We are God's family. What can we do to make life better for whomever? For self, for you, for the community at large. It extends beyond the landlocked territory we call Vermont, because we're more than just an individual. We're overcomers. We're God's soldiers. We're making a difference. And he would, you know, you got that from him. He wasn't as if he was heavy-headed with a evangelical Bible beating you across your head, but his words, his values, his talk. And I have been in and out of many churches in the 8 states and the 8 different cities where I've lived and worked. But John is the kind of person who reminded me that if it was possible to package him in terms of a template and share that template with others, the world would certainly be a better place. Love the man, love the person, love the preacher, loved God's gift to us all. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much. Someone else?
Karen. Karen wants to be recognized.
All right, go Karen.
Hi, Lynn. Thank you so much for letting me be part of this. As you know, John was a longtime mentor and friend to the Vermont Low Income Advocacy Council, and he was there long before I was. But I did have the opportunity to spend a couple of years while a Camp About Face was still functioning at Bethany Birches, and then I think it was somewheres up in northern Vermont. I can't remember exactly where, but we did travel around a bit. So I did get to spend a number of times with John at Camp About Face, and he entertained us and he inspired us. And I heard the Addison County love song many, many times, and he sang it for years after at different gatherings. We always appreciated our great partnership with the UCC, and John was one of our biggest champions for that. As chair of Vermont Assistance, which is the funding arm of the low income advocacy, John understood what needed to be done and to help us be successful. And he was not shy about raising money for the good cause. In fact, one of my fondest memories and the time I got to spend with John alone, I would prepare the annual fundraising letter and the contributions would come in. And then I would take all of those who had contributed and prepare thank you notes. And I would go to John's home in Waterbury, and we would sit at his desk and look out at the beautiful land and the pond, and he would pen thank you notes to everybody. But during that time, obviously, we talked, and he was just I just enjoyed those hours so much. I just remember them as being a high point of being able to spend some time with him. Even after his retirement, he continued to join us at different gatherings, and he kept in touch. I think the last time I saw John was at his wife Ramona's funeral, and he was in a wheelchair, and I did get the chance to speak to him, and he was so excited to see Gus Seelig and John Schulenberger and myself. And of course he asked about Gilead, and he was just so excited to hear that we were going strong in our 48th year. I just greatly appreciated his mentorship, his message. There was no better champion for the low-income people and people with disabilities. And his message was all about equity, and it was all about love. And I will miss him.
Thank you, Karen. Someone else? Steve. Steve, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
Brings back a lot of memories, and I've been thinking about the first time we encountered John. Heather and I was a first-year student at Andover Newton, and Heather had decided it would be a good idea to kind of dip my toe into the church life that I thought I was going to be exploring later. So I went to Walker Hawley. Some of you may know that name. He was a Vermonter, but he ran the placement office. At that time, one of the offices was in Boston. And I talked to him asked him if were there summer experiences available. And when Bob and Kathy talked about being a summer minister, this all came back. Walker Hawley told me about the summer ministry program in Vermont. He said, and I'll talk to somebody up there and see if there's anything that we can do. 10:15 that night, I got a call from John Nutting. And John said, I hear you might be interested in doing something in a church. Would you be interested in coming to Vermont? And well, sure. And so we came to Vermont, and only later do we find that John was offering a position that was not available. After he offered the job, he had to find a place for us to be, which he did. He talked to people in South Royalton, who at that time were in the process of a search. He talked them into having, in essence, our presence there as kind of a short-term interim. And so we spent the summer in South Royalton because John bent enough arms in South Royalton Church to accommodate his promise and the opportunity that we had. And from that moment on, our encounters with John, he's been kind of an angelic presence in our lives in a variety of ways, but he's been very helpful, and we've been blessed through our association with John and all of the memories that we have of Vermont, and now living again in Vermont, and we're most grateful for all of that. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of our story.
Thank you, Steve. Someone else? Okay, I only see one screen at a time, so I want to make sure I'm not missing somebody on another screen. Okay. Everly,
Lynn?
are you talking to us? Yes.
Yes, I am. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just a quick, as Betty mentioned in a note recently, Betty and I visited John at the nursing home in Morrisville, and probably last fall. And we had a nice visit with him, but he was pretty groggy that morning. It was just before lunch, And one of us said something about the Addison County Love Song, and we started to sing it, but we couldn't remember the words. And John, without missing a beat, picked up on it. And we, the three of us, had an opportunity to sing the Addison County Love Song together. And it was sort of a wonderful farewell. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I don't want to miss anybody. If someone else
Lynn,
would like to have an up.
Doreen here.
Hi, Doreen.
Hi there. I in 1996, when John retired, Jean Andrews and I had the daunting privilege of following both John and Hal after their retirement in conference ministry. We, on occasion, were very glad, because no one can fill John's shoes, that the missions portion of his ministry here was not what we had been hired to fill after he retired. However, we had the churches, and he had a love of the small churches here in Vermont like nobody else I have ever run into. And he also had a way, as you all have been attesting to, of making things happen that needed to happen. And sometimes, you know, he carved his own channels, shall we say, to make these things happen. The first time I met him was when I had come to Vermont when my husband was called to serve the Berry Congregational Church, had two small kids, was looking for a different kind of ministry, didn't even have a UCC profile active at the point. And within months, I was the called pastor in the Berlin Congregational Church, where I stayed for 24 years. John had a way of knowing who was around and networking and making things happen. And I was so aware of this, following in his footsteps, because I would hear story after story after story in these small churches where John made things happen. And he didn't stand on a soapbox. He didn't want to claim credit for it all. He didn't do it out of a feistiness in a way or anything. He was grace personified everywhere he went in this conference. And the small churches benefited from his love for as long as he was here. Thank you.
Lynn, this is Emily. Thank you all. It's really hard. But my dad was a great connector, and he truly emanated love out of every fiber that he possessed. And I'm fortunate enough to be a teacher. I teach first graders. Sometimes it's a bit like herding cats, but one of the things that I carry on from my dad and my mom is singing. And every year, and I sang this tried to sing it at my mom's service about love is something when you give it away. And so I teach that to my children every year. The other thing is that I also had the fortunate experience with my dad when I was back home the last time after mom's service. And I asked Dad, I said, you know, Dad, do you still have your guitar? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, have you played it in a while? He's like, no, not for a while. And I said, would you be willing to play it and sing some songs with me? Because I've been working on the song, This Little Light of Mine, teaching it to the kids in my first grade class. And he agreed, and he goes, well, I might be a little rusty. And he kind of smirked. Well, I handed him the guitar, and his hands and fingers just danced across those strings, and he didn't miss a word. And the fortunate thing I have is I had enough presence of mind to record it on my phone. So one of the blessings that he gave me was the gift of song, as he did so many people in his life. My brother told stories at the service, at the graveside service that we had, of going around to various people's homes and, it just singing songs, and people never really knew that he was sharing the gospel. Another story that I remember him telling was sitting on the courthouse steps in North Hyde Park, and just visiting with the locals, as he called them, and just listening. He was also a great listener. And when people speak of the little churches, they were very near and dear to his heart and to my mom's. Also, Alden spoke at this service, and he read the poem by E.E. Cummings, The Little Church, and it just totally encaptured what that meant to him. And when you brought up about all the sticky notes on the books, well, I think I carry on the tradition because I have oodles of sticky notes sticking out from my books. And as a matter of fact, I do have to leave. I have a online teaching course to keep my learning going and live and fresh for my students. So I am going to have to leave, but I just, seeing all of your faces, and I remember hearing lots of names and of my dad and my mom sharing about all of you and how important you all were to him. And just one last story that, when you shared about music, and Teresa, Betty might remember this story. We were with a host family in El Salvador because I went with him. And we were with that family, and it was approaching dark. And neither one of us, I spoke a little bit of Spanish, but not a lot. But we decided to teach them the hokey pokey. And so there we were in a circle, and all we could see were these brilliant, blazing white smiles, and seeing shadows dance, and the gift of music being shared in another country, in another language. But it didn't matter because I was doing what my dad did, which was sharing love and music. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to share with you, I realized that this is from Morris Pike, who worked with John. And he writes, in the early 1960s, John Nutting, York Peeler, and I did a production of God's Trombones for the annual statewide Pilgrim Fellowship Youth Rally. John sang spirituals and original pieces. One of the 600 plus kids there turned to her minister and said, "That man can't sing." And after another John song, she whispered, "He's just like Woody Guthrie." She had it exactly right. And when I told John, he simply said, "Yeah." How wonderful that we could be conference staff colleagues together. So that's from Morris Pike. And I'm going to try to play, I have a recording from Hal Harrison, since they worked together and then retired at the same time. And I don't know whether I'm going to be able to pull this off, but I'm going to give it my best shot here.
Not only because of the sadness and loss, but it was because I could not stop my mind from remembering stories about John. They just came flooding in, not giving me much rest that particular evening. We worked together, John and I, for 18 years. And you can get into a lot of trouble if you work hard enough for 18 years. But I want to remember the time before I knew John, but an era that he often talked about. The Vermont Conference from the 1840s had a program called Summer Pastors. There were enough churches that could only be open in the summer that needed ministry, and there was always other opportunities for ministry happening in Vermont. So, therefore, seminary students could get some training and the churches could get some ministry. John came to Vermont, I think, first as a summer pastor. He came to Westover, stayed with a farm family, and did ministry for the people in that area, that place. He, I think, at that point, began to make a covenant with this land, hard, rocky, difficult land, and a covenant with the people who struggled to make a living on that same land. And basically a covenant with that mighty little state we call Vermont. And we were blessed year after year after year with that covenant being worked out.
Right.
John's ministry.
Okay. Were you able to hear any of that? Oh, good. Okay. All right. I'm grateful to Kurt Schaffert, who is the one who met with Hal so that his words could be present with us today. So I appreciate that. And I think I would, let's see, I'm in the process of redoing bookcases, and any of you who have bookcases know what that's like. Here it is. So this has been invaluable in my ministry. So this is the book that John wrote, Becoming the United Church of Christ in Vermont. And there are records and anecdotes and meeting notes and just an amazing group of things that for all of the churches in the Vermont Conference. So when I came new 12 years ago, and I still use it, if I'm going to a church, I always try to look up and see what it says in John's book for that. So I'm very grateful for that. So why don't we end this time and by sharing, just one or two words or a short sentence of what are you grateful for about John? Where is the gratitude for you in the midst of this? And this is going to be a little chaotic, but let's give it a try anyway.
Lynn?
Yes.
I would just like to share that I'm so grateful for John's ministry. he did love the little church, and I was baptized in a little church at age 24 in East Hardwick. And I'm seeing so many people on here that impacted my life. And I think even baptized me. And John, even though he was retired, was very close to my late husband, Bill Lingelbach. And so was Hal Harrison. And they were very supportive of me during that time, and then into my time for ordained ministry. And so I've been so grateful for John's ministry and for all of you who have been there for me.
Thank you, Jackie.
I'm really grateful for the welcoming presence he always had. Even if you hadn't seen him for years and years, you know, he would just embrace you, and it would feel like you hadn't, those years just sort of melted away. And of course, his music.
Another gratitude. Betty.
Among many things, certainly his passion for justice just amazed me.
John's joy of life and his laughter and creativity.
He was our cheerleader, and also his kind of dry observations about life that put everything into perspective.
Friendship. Even over, you know, go through, like Elizabeth said, even though you could go for years without seeing him, and when you see him again, it was like you had just, you know, been seeing him every day. So yeah, friendship.
He just made you feel like you were the only one in the room when he was chatting with you, and something that I strive to do, and in that good listening that he's able to do, he was able to do so.
I really think when I think of John, I think of him as being approachable by everyone. He was a huge man. He was a big man, but he didn't present himself as a big man. And I think he got smaller and smaller as he lived, because he brought himself down to the level of everyone he was with. He was a real servant, and he was a great ambassador for God.
And one time he asked me how was ministry going, and I said I was feeling overwhelmed. This was in my early 30s. And he looked at me and he said, Kathy, it doesn't have to be like that. Have fun, have a light heart.
Hello there.
Yes.
Is that me?
Mm-hmm. You're there. Go ahead.
Hi, Lynn.
Yes.
Yeah, this is John Senning. I'm like all the rest of you. I've got too many things to even mention. So maybe I'll just point out a fact that probably over 50 years ago, when I first moved to Vermont, John was a neighbor up the hill in Shutesville. He lived on the top of the hill, and I lived about 2 houses down from him. I was a bachelor, didn't know anything about my wife, the UCC, or anything like that, but he and Ramona showed up as a neighbor just to say hello and welcome me into the neighborhood. And we had a chat, and I got to know him. And then I think it was about 2 or 3 days later, he came back to the house
and he had an armload of curtains that Ramona had found in the attic. And he wanted to give me curtains for my bachelor apartment, or it was a house actually, because I had computer paper on the windows instead of curtains. I didn't have any curtains, and he brought me my first set of curtains in Vermont. And I think for the next 50 years, off and on, I've just enjoyed every single encounter I've had with John. And I just wanted to share that with you all. Thanks for all of you sharing what you have to say. It's wonderful to see you all again. Take care. I love you
very
all.
much. Any other words of gratitude?
So I unmuted us. So John and Judy Clark, and we live in Hyde Park. And I'm like this guy that just spoke, have too many things to share. He baptized my mother and I when I was 18 and married John and I. And actually, I guess it started out when I was younger because he married my father's cousin. So I've known him all the while I was growing up. And John and I've just always looked at John as a teacher and mentor to us. And it's so great hearing everybody's stories because you think, hey, I thought I was the one that was special to John. And it's so great to hear all these, fill in the pieces that we wouldn't know about. But I think one of the biggest things was John's acceptance and love of everyone. It didn't matter who they were, young, old, black, white, farmers, because we were farmers, and he always, thought farmers were some kind of special breed. So anyway, thank you for this opportunity.
Just his humor. I just loved his humor.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Are we coming down to the conclusion at this point? So the scripture has been sort of with me over the last few days, and this is one that we all, I think, probably know. There is nothing in life or death, in the world that is, or in the world as it shall be, nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God known to us in Jesus Christ. And that's a thanks be to God, I think. So let me say a brief word of prayer and go. God, thank you for this gathering, for being able to say out loud and hear all of the wonderful things that John Nutting did and was and sung and painted. We give you thanks for his life, for his ministry, for all of the things that have been named in this time. So we lift our gratitude to you, and we commend John Nutting's life to you. So thank you for being with us as we gather, and we pray you will also be with us as we scatter. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thank you all for being here and being part of this. And if you know somebody who might appreciate hearing this, send them along, and I'll get a recording to them at that point. Okay.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks for
Thank
doing
you,
that.
Lynn. It was wonderful to see so many familiar faces that I haven't seen for so long.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.